Hi again, everyone. I can tell everyone's enjoying a good lunch discussion, so sorry to interrupt that. But I would like to get on with our second keynote speaker of the day. And in order to do that, I would like to introduce Malcolm Kay, who's Superintendent of the Stamford American School, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Tara, and I hope you're all enjoying your lunch. And this is kind of a little opportunity for me as Platinum sponsor just to do a quick commercial, so I hope you'll forgive me for doing that. But certainly my team will be very unhappy if I didn't just say a little bit about our school. So, and then Joachim, I'll get to you and tell people all about the great things that you've done in your life and what you're going to bring to our conference. So just a few little thoughts. This time last year, I was new in Hong Kong. And I was standing in front of you at this very podium talking about Stamford American School, explaining it was really Stamford American International School. And we were just about to start on this project of bringing a new school into Hong Kong. And on Monday, just about a year later, we opened a new school in Hong Kong. And so I'd like to thank the American Chamber of Commerce for all their support, because they've been very supportive. And many of you for supporting us in that endeavor. As you will know from the press, opening a school on time in Hong Kong is not the easiest of things to do. So I also want to thank my team for all of that. Our assessment when we moved into Hong Kong was actually Hong Kong was ready for a new type of school that was a little bit more forward-thinking. We looked at the education that was taking place, kind of looked a bit 1960s-ish to us. We thought maybe we'd bring some new ideas into Hong Kong and see how those worked. Those new ideas really revolved around three pillars. The three pillars were personalized learning, a conservative standards-based core, and then a very, very modern approach to pedagogy, the way we teach, inquiry-based pedagogy. And we really found that that resonated with families and that they actually liked what we were doing because we were forward-thinking. Our sort of motto was, let's produce a school that provides an education that relates to the future that children will occupy, rather than based upon the experience that we've had, all of us, in our schools. What does the future look like? Let's see if we can work with it. And our enrollment was strong, and it was an indication of the fact that parents really appreciated it. We've taken market share away from other schools. Always like to do that, sorry guys. And that to us was an indication of maybe this is the right way to go in terms of the quality of education that needs to be provided. A couple of things that families remarked upon. One, we were thoughtful in what we did because we explained why. In fact, that's what families have told us. Why did you choose Stamford? And one of the things they've said to us is because you were the only school that explained why you do what you do, as opposed to just what you do. And we will continue to do that. We will think deeply about what we do. And then the other thing was that we recognized with families that from the age of 4.5, the research is very clear, that children are capable of very, very creative thought. And we build our program on teaching children from the age of 5, that's the first level in our school, to be entrepreneurs, and by the time they graduate, have developed intellectual property and know how to patent it. Again, something new in schools, but really important, probably resonates with some of the things we were talking about this morning. So that really is a little bit of a summary of Stamford, and thank you for listening to that. But now I move on to the most important part of my comments this morning, Yoken, which is about you. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Joachim von Amsberg, Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Joachim drives the strategic direction for the bank, including its sectoral and country priorities, its investment strategy and programming, its economic analysis and research, its operating budget. Wow. He oversees the bank's environment and social policies, other operational policies, and their implementation. He previously served in a number of progressive senior roles at the World Bank, where he most recently held the position of Vice President, Development Finance, where he was responsible for the replenishment and stewardship of the International Development Association, the World Bank's Fund for the Poorest, and for trust fund and partnership operations. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. von Amsberg. Joachim, thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm, for these very kind words of welcome. A very happy good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for having me here and allowing me to share with you a few thoughts reflecting on the still very early experience of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that was opening its doors just last year. I will structure my remarks into three stories. The first story is what motivated the bank, which is the so-called infrastructure finance paradox. And that's a story that I suspect many of you will know very well, many of you much better than me, so I'll be quite brief. The second story I want to tell you is the success stories of the multilateral development banking over the last decades. That's maybe a story that not everybody knows, but many of you will have heard about that. And then the third story, probably few of you will have heard, which is really the story of AIIB over the last year and a half of its existence. So let me start with the infrastructure finance paradox. Infrastructure is, of course, about connectivity, connecting people to services, water, electricity, data, connecting people to jobs and markets, transport, and connecting markets, power, water, transport, within a city, across a country, and across countries. Now, infrastructure is critical for the functioning of economies, critical for the happiness of people, and infrastructure is often lagging behind. When you look at the large cities in the emerging world, you think about polluted, congested cities where infrastructure is badly lagging behind economic development, and congestion, pollution shows, or lack of access to water, lack of access to power, are obstacles to development. But there's also a different story, which is infrastructure as a driver of development. And I think China, like no other country, represents that role of infrastructure. A country that has invested in large-scale infrastructure before the demand was there, sometimes built entire cities before the people were there, and driven economic development that way. So we have both lack of infrastructure as a bottleneck, but also infrastructure investment as a driver of economic development. Some of you may have read some of those global studies that have put huge numbers of infrastructure needs on the table. Let me just refer to one of those studies. The Global Institute of McKinsey put out a couple of years ago a study that claimed that the world needs $90 trillion of infrastructure investments over the next 15 years. That's $6 trillion every year. I don't get my head around what a trillion really is, but it's a very big number. $6 trillion a year for the next 15 years. And much of it is in Asia, and much of that is in emerging Asia. And when I talk about infrastructure, I am focusing here on infrastructure in the emerging world. Now that need, that demand is driven by some big trends. Of course, economic growth, trade, urbanization. Until 2050, we expect that every week 1.5 million people will move to cities. Every week, 1.5 million people. Think about what that means for infrastructure needs, what that means for cities. That's one Hong Kong every 5 weeks, if I get the numbers right, until 2050. Just to show the dynamics that drives infrastructure. Technological change. Smart cities, I heard on the last panel discussion about smart cities, driverless vehicles, smart power grids. That links to the next big trend, energy transition, climate change, energy transition. We know we have to dramatically change the nature of our energy systems. The world has come together in the Paris Agreement to decide it needs to change. That means dramatic changes in terms of what these investments in power will look like. Another number, the $90 trillion investments supposedly needed relates to a current stock of infrastructure in the world of about $50 trillion. So if you add up all the roads that exist, all the power stations, all the dams, and value them, it's about $50 trillion. So we're about to build another 2 infrastructure worlds in the next 15 years. Now, how we do that will make or break the climate, will make or break whether Paris will be implemented or not. So very, very important big questions behind infrastructure that drive investments. So $6 trillion a year is a lot more than the current actual investments in infrastructure, which are about half of that. So there's a huge gap. Now, I said initially I want to talk about the infrastructure finance paradox. So what is the paradox? In my mind, the paradox is you have this huge demand for infrastructure finance to fill this gap of unmet infrastructure needs. And on the other hand, you have asset managers sitting on tens of trillions of dollars. Some of that, a significant share of that, yielding 0 or even negative returns. And yet very little of that flows into emerging country infrastructure. It's a trickle, despite a lot of conferences and a lot of talks and a lot of panels. What flows actually into developing country, emerging country infrastructure is a trickle. So that's the paradox. You have trillions of dollars of needs, demand for infrastructure financing, and you have trillions of dollars of supply, because these asset managers come to our offices week after week and say, well, where can we invest? We would like to go into infrastructure, because infrastructure provides reliable long-term returns, perfectly suited to insurance companies, pension funds. So there is this huge latent supply of infrastructure finance, and yet the two don't come together. That's the paradox. Now, many of you know why that paradox exists. I would put it in those terms: the paradox exists because the demand is not for the same good as the supply is for. The demand is a need for a service. The supply is finance for bankable projects that have a well-defined return for a well-defined risk. And the two are still worlds apart. We're talking about countries where often the regulatory environment is such that simply the need doesn't translate into a financeable project. You sometimes talk about infrastructure services where there really is no payment mechanism. There is no way to commercially finance rural roads. You can't put up a toll post in every little farm-to-market road. You usually have huge challenges with the technical preparation of projects. So there may be studies, but they may not be reliable, not be sound. You may have major problems with land acquisition. You may have a country where you don't trust the rule of law, where you don't believe the government will stick to the contracts it signs with a concessionaire or with a service provider. Or you may have poorly structured projects where the wrong party is supposed to take certain risks that that party isn't well suited to take. So it's many, many little pieces that are missing to bridge the infrastructure finance paradox. And our challenge as working in the space is to build that bridge, is to create all those pieces so that the money can actually flow to where the need is. There's no single bullet, no magic bullet to address this challenge, but there's a multitude of actions by governments at different levels, different sectors, different levels of government, regulators, technical consultants, bankers, lawyers, institutional investors who all come together, have to come together to fix and overcome this paradox. That's my first story. As I said, this would not have been new to very many of you who are actually working and very active in this space. Second story, the multilateral development banks. In the 1940s, the nations of the world decided to tackle some big problems of reconstructing Europe after the war by setting up the World Bank. At the same time as they set up the International Monetary Fund and the GATT that later became the WTO. So a new architecture for multilateral financial cooperation began in Bretton Woods. In each of these areas, the nations of the world decided it was more efficient, more effective to act together than to act bilaterally and individually. Now, these institutions have played a very important role, first in the reconstruction of Europe, then in financing investments in developing countries. Today, I would submit that these institutions are even more important than they were back then, because the scale of global challenges, I just mentioned climate change, but financial vulnerability, trade, other global public goods are just as important and much bigger in scale than they were 70 years ago. The job is far from done, and in fact the role is more important than it's ever been. These institutions, I've myself worked in the World Bank for 25 years, have been an incredibly efficient way of channeling and leveraging public finance. The main arm of the World Bank has been capitalized over the decades with no more than 13 billion US dollars, 1-3, no more. That's the only thing shareholders put into the World Bank, the IBRD arm of the World Bank. That capital, with the retained earnings, allows the World Bank to support a balance sheet 20 times that size and year after year invest some 25, sometimes $30 billion a year in developing countries where others cannot invest. That financial leverage, how much return you get for scarce public resources, taxpayers' money, I think is what makes these institutions attractive. Now, I'm telling you the second story because it links to the first story. Because the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the EBRD, IFC, and others, have been one of the few players who have over decades tried to build the bridge, tried to bring capital into infrastructure in developing countries, because they have the ability to put many of these building blocks together. Work with countries on the policy environment, work on the regulation, work with regulators, bring technical consultants to design sound projects, bring financial consultants to structure those projects well, de-risk projects by allowing governments to make credible commitments, because governments happen to own these institutions, so they typically behave better, and these institutions have leverage vis-à-vis their own shareholders when it comes to making credible commitments toward third-party investors. But most of what the multilateral development banks have done has been on their own balance sheet, meaning selling bonds to investors, institutional investors and others, and channeling those resources into projects in developing countries. Now, the challenge of that model is that the world has outgrown the multilateral development banks, and in particular outgrown their balance sheets. So if you compare the balance sheets of these banks to the trillion investment needs, it's just a tiny trickle. And while they've done good work, clearly their work is in any way insufficient to address the challenges of infrastructure investments in developing countries. So why not just grow these institutions? Well, that has been difficult because of their governance, because those countries who set up these institutions in the 40s and 50s set them up to give weight and decision rights according to the economic distribution of how the world looked in the 1940s. And it's been extremely difficult to adjust that to how the world looks in 2017. Meaning rich countries, OECD countries have been very reluctant to give up shares that countries, emerging countries like China, other emerging countries would have liked to buy to grow these institutions. And that second story that I told you, together with the first story, is really the beginning of the third story I want to tell you in this brief talk. Because it is really the motivation of the first story plus the challenges that I just told you about the second story that gave rise to the creation of AIIB. In a nutshell, AIIB was born out of the huge unmet infrastructure investment needs in emerging countries, the effectiveness of the multilateral development banks to actually help address that need, but their inability to grow. And so, coupled with a lack of voice for emerging countries in those institutions, that led to China in 2013 proposing the creation of a new multilateral development bank, which today has become known as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. That idea, proposed in 2013, was greeted by support. Many Asian countries quickly supported that idea, but it was also greeted by skepticism and by concern, by suspicion that China was trying to undermine the existing multilateral system, or that China was planning to undermine quality project standards. So in the subsequent negotiations of the founding of AIIB, European countries joined the negotiations, and quickly some fundamental agreements were formed between China, the other Asian initiators, and European countries about some of the basic principles of this new bank. Two of those principles that are particularly important for the existence of the bank are: one, a genuine multilateral decision-making and governance, meaning the 57 founding members would jointly decide the policies, the directions, the projects of this bank. It would not be one shareholder, which later became the largest shareholder, China, which could dominate the bank. It would be a truly multilateral effort where decisions are made in consensus among the entire shareholdership. And secondly, consensus on the importance of high-quality project standards, high environmental, social, and governance standards, so that projects that the new bank would finance would be those that represent international best practice in terms of how, for example, a power dam needs to be done so that it does not do undue harm to the environment or to people who have to be resettled, just to give you one particularly controversial example. So these negotiations concluded in 2015. In 2016, last year, the bank opened its doors. 57 founding members, $100 billion of capital, 20% of which is paid in. China holds 25% of the voting and 25% of the capital. Now we are up and running. We are making loans, we're making equity investments. We have by now committed $3 billion to 18 projects. Everything from large-scale mega infrastructure like a very large gas pipeline that takes gas from the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey into Europe, to very small-scale infrastructure that brings clean water and electricity to slum dwellers in Indonesian mid-sized cities. Or our last investment just approved on Monday this week, investments in 11 private companies that have won the bidding for supplying solar photovoltaic energy to the Egyptian power company. A project we're particularly proud of because it stands for the sustainable energy direction that we want to pursue. We do private investment, public investment, and everything in between, which is important for infrastructure because so often local governments, provinces, states, cities, or state-owned enterprises play a key role. We've set ourselves 3 priorities. One, sustainable infrastructure. I already spoke about the Paris Agreement. I spoke about renewable energy, which is and will continue to be a very large focus of ours. Secondly, cross-country connectivity, building transport, water, power connections across countries. And thirdly, mobilizing private capital for infrastructure. That's really directly tackling the infrastructure finance paradox that I introduced in the first few minutes of my talk. So we're up and running, but we're still a startup organization. We have 120 staff. So we're very small, very much at the beginning. And sometimes I feel the media coverage is running way ahead of how we feel. We're really just building a bank from scratch with 120 people, as I mentioned. We have received AAA ratings from the 3 international rating agencies just a few weeks ago. So we're now financially also in a position to issue debt at low cost, which allows us to leverage our capital and scale up our operations. If you look at our basic governance and finances, we are quite similar to the existing multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. But we're very different because we are so new and so small. Our president often talks about AIIB as clean, green, and lean. We are clean, meaning free of corruption, green, meaning environmentally friendly like the others, but we are lean unlike the others because we are really just a small startup shop which therefore can be more responsive, more timely, more flexible than a very large organization can be. The experience so far has been very positive. I think we find very strong demand from both public and private sector clients. We see strong alignment between our shareholders who I think are profoundly committed to the agreements made during the negotiations. In particular, we experienced China as very seriously committed to the agreements made vis-à-vis other shareholders and upholding those basic agreements which have been the foundation for other countries joining. In fact, our shareholdership has grown from 57 to 80 countries by now, which I think is a testament to the governance and the trust that has been built. You would ask me if I didn't respond, so let me mention how AIIB relates to the famous Belt and Road Initiative that so much is talked about. We are actually very different from Belt and Road. We are a bank with a balance sheet, with a multilateral governance, very hard, you can touch us and we can tell you exactly what we are. Belt and Road is very different. Belt and Road is a slogan, it's an initiative that has very fuzzy boundaries, very fuzzy borders. It encompasses an initiative for connectivity between Asia, Europe, and Africa that has found a lot of resonance with countries along those Belt and Road corridors. But it's in itself not an organization. And so we see there's two very different entities, a multilateral bank, AIIB, and a Chinese initiative called Belt and Road. But there's an overlap because the Belt and Road Initiative is promoting connectivity, infrastructure investments to connect countries. We are a bank that invests in infrastructure and supports cross-country connectivity. So of course, we will finance some, maybe many projects that fall under Belt and Road Initiative. But we will review those projects with the same due diligence as we review other projects, and we will finance many other projects that have little, if anything, to do with Belt and Road, like slum upgrading in Indonesia, which is probably even outside of the widest definition of Belt and Road. So let me close with a few comments on Hong Kong's membership in AIIB. Hong Kong is among the members that have brought up our membership from 57 to 80 in recent months. We're very excited about Hong Kong joining AIIB. One, because of course Hong Kong is an important financial center. So for our banking function, it is very desirable to have Hong Kong as a member so that we can benefit from the financial functions. We as a bank can benefit from the financial functions that are well performed in Hong Kong. But there's a second reason why we're excited about Hong Kong's membership, and that relates to the first paradox I mentioned, to the first story I told you, which is the story that many different players need to come together to address the fundamental challenge for which we were founded, overcoming the infrastructure finance paradox or the challenge of infrastructure finance in emerging Asia. We need an ecosystem of governments, project developers, equity investors, lawyers, consultants, banks, institutional investors. In other words, all of you, together with multilateral development banks like ourselves, to actually crack that nut. And we see that Hong Kong in Asia is one of the few places that actually have a critical mass of these players. So we feel very excited to connect ourselves to your ecosystem and ask how we can work together with you, with the networks that you have, to really bring together the bridge that connects infrastructure finance demand and infrastructure finance supply. We feel that Hong Kong has many critical elements that could move that agenda forward. And because this is the agenda that has motivated our creation, we're very happy that Hong Kong has joined AIIB and very excited to become a useful member of this, what I would call infrastructure finance ecosystem. Of course, many initiatives are already ongoing. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority is working very actively in this area, and we think that some of the ideas they're pursuing are particularly interested. We are trying to figure out exactly how we should offer our services to complement those of others around these tables here in this room and others who are present in this ecosystem. So I want to close my remarks with an invitation to work together to overcome the infrastructure finance paradox, and thereby work together to connect Asia and improve prosperity in this important part of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? We have plenty of time for questions. So if you want to raise your hand, we'll start over here. And if you'd give us your name and affiliation, please.
Yes. Hi, I'm Lilia from Lim Logus and Masters. Thank you, Joachim, for that speech. I have a particular question around the One Belt, One Road agenda. It seems to be missing today's conference, but I'd like to hear your views, or maybe even perspective, whether increasingly you see private-public partnerships being built around the One Belt, One Road agenda, and that would be of great interest as to how the international players of the world can participate in this program. Fuzzy, as you say it is right now, I do admit.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Two comments. So one is, I think, the strong response, positive resonance that the One Belt, One Road initiative has found in the world is very clear. I think countries along those corridors have seen and are seeing Belt and Road as a motivator for investments in infrastructure in their countries, so they're enthusiastic. I think at a time when another large nation seems to express doubts about the benefits of free trade, I think many countries come around the concept of Belt and Road that seems to hold up the flag of the welfare benefits of free trade and connectivity. So it's, I think, not surprising maybe that there is this resonance. Now you ask about the public-private partnerships. Since Belt and Road itself isn't really an organization, it's very difficult to structure projects in the sense as you and I are probably thinking about projects in terms of Belt and Road. When you and I talk about projects, we think about feasibility study with engineering design, a financial structure, and then legal agreements of how you finance something. That's very far away from the kind of conversation that so far happened about Belt and Road, which are maps with broad brushed lines and the like. So I think the public-private partnerships come into play a few steps down the road. And they come into play when corridors and broad ideas get translated into specific investments. When you're no longer just drawing a big brush line from China through Central Asia into Europe, but you're actually designing a toll road through a Central Asian country. And then you will have to deal with the regulatory regime of that country, because the bidding for that toll road will have to happen under the legal regime of that particular country. So you actually very quickly come back to that broader agenda of bringing private capital into infrastructure, because the framework, the policy framework, the legal framework of each project is driven by the country it's located in. Infrastructure is physical. It happens in a country. It doesn't happen in some conference. And so that's why I think we very quickly will connect back to that much broader agenda, where, of course, a lot of experience has been gathered over the last decades on private participation in infrastructure. I mean, from my previous job in the World Bank, where we've done endless studies trying to sort of take experience from country to country. What is it that allows a country to successfully privatize or bring investments into toll roads, water supply, power supply? So there's a very rich body of experience that I think is very relevant in this new space, which is motivated by Belt and Road, but for its implementation will require all the little building blocks that we've kind of gathered over the last decades.
Over here, Barrett. We're coming, we're coming.
Thanks, Tara. Barrett Bingley with the Economist Group and the chair of the Trade and Investment Committee here at the AmCham. So my question, as such a new institution, and you've described how big the infrastructure needs are, and you've started investing in projects now, how are you prioritizing what to invest in? In particular, as you're kind of, I imagine, in a testing and learning phase. So just if you could unpack that for us. Thanks.
So we have prepared for ourselves a set of investment criteria. And in particular, we have the basic sort of banking due diligence requirements. So we ask whether a project is technically soundly prepared, whether it's environmentally and socially sound, and whether it's actually bankable, meaning that the entity that we are lending to or investing in can actually pay back its loan. So that's sort of the basic banking due diligence. Then comes the strategic question of, is this project aligned with our strategic priorities, sustainable energy, cross-country connectivity, or private capital mobilization? And is it aligned with the country's priorities? So we look at, is this toll road actually something that is important in the country's investment planning, or is it something that some investor has dreamt up, even though there is really no connection to the country's own a priority? And then thirdly and lastly comes the value added. Why is our financing sought for this project? And do we do something catalytic here? Of course, we will sometimes finance projects simply because we provide longer-term financing than others, and therefore we can make a project that wouldn't be viable without our financing viable. And sometimes that is a good role. But we cannot play that role at the scale of trillions. So we have to ask ourselves, what other value added is there? Do we, for example, through our participation, create comfort for other co-investors that they will be protected from certain typically government-originated risks? That's often the value added that we bring to a project. Because as I said, governments behave typically better, if I can put it in casual terms, when a project is co-invested by a bank that they hold shares in. So we ask those questions, but then even more importantly, can we kind of help build a market? So can we help create structures that can be replicated even without our participation? To give you an example, we are currently in negotiations with some partners, some of whom may be in this room, about platforms where we can pool brownfield infrastructure assets, possibly provide some credit enhancement, securitize, and sell them off to institutional investors. That's an initiative that would bring sort of a new class of investors into the space and possibly be scalable well beyond our own participation. So we're particularly excited about such initiatives because we are small compared to the needs. So we are trying to do something that is in some way catalytic and scalable.
I saw another hand up right here.
I hear you, but maybe nobody else.
Relatively new organization. How do you see the organization growing in the next 5 years, particularly in the context of the upcoming People's Party Congress next month and the current 5-year plan, China 5-year plan?
To be frank, I think neither the 5-year plan nor the Party Congress have particular significance for us because China is our largest shareholder, but as I said, not dominant, and we're not an instrument of Chinese policy. We are a multilateral body. Of course, China is the largest shareholder, holds strong influence, but not a dominant influence. So frankly, I would say there's no direct connection. The 5-year horizon sees us just gradually building the institution. Hiring staff, we are right now 120. In 5 years' time, my bet would be we'll probably be about 400, 500 staff. In 5 years, we'll probably make annual commitments in the order of $8, $9 billion. Right now, we're doing $2 to $3 billion. In 5 years' time, we will be present in the capital markets as a significant issuer of supranational securities, so we'll be issuing bonds in the markets. I hope in 5 years' time we will still be seen as a lean organization. That's one of the issues that keep me awake at night. We work in a complicated business. Infrastructure is physical, it's complicated. Infrastructure projects can do damage. They can kill people. So we are very mindful of how tough the business is, especially in countries with a weak institutional environment. And yet we want to stay a very lean organization, different from our peers who have grown to be rather large and rather complex bureaucracies. And the idea we have, how we can do that, is by partnering, networking, outsourcing. So different from a World Bank, which was created at a time in the 40s when there was nobody else around, and therefore had to do everything in-house, we see all of you. Many of you work in this space. Consultant companies, law firms, banks. You all have tremendous experience in this space. So rather than us replicating all of your capacity in-house and becoming another bureaucracy, we'd much rather work with you. Whether in partnerships, outsourced, that's one of our sort of big agendas, how to make that lean business model work. But I really hope that in 5 years we will still be seen as that lean, responsive, agile, different organization.
Any more questions from the floor? I have one in between, but we'll go to the table back there. Yes.
Thank you. Julia Harries, University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I've actually got two questions. I wonder if you could possibly speak a little bit about if and how you collaborate with the regional multilateral, the Asian Development Bank, number one. And number two, are you still interested in US membership of the AIIB?
So yes, we are very keen partners with the other multilateral development banks. I have spoken more about the World Bank here simply because it's my previous employer, so I have my personal experience in the World Bank. But we are working equally with the Asian Development Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also the European Investment Bank as partners. Simply because these institutions have tremendous experience in the space we're working in and large technical and staff capacity that we don't have. So 120 people is really very few if you consider the administrative and other back office functions. So we have actually very few technical staff. So we very keenly depend and work with the other MDBs to be able to deliver quality projects. In particular, we rely to a very large extent on due diligence undertaken by the other multilateral development banks. That's a very healthy partnership because some of our multilateral partners have very strong staff and technical capacity, but have run out of capital and money. And so there is true complementarity between our clean balance sheet with very little technical staff capacity vis-a-vis other banks that have a very large technical capacity, but have in many cases either globally or for specific countries run out of capital to invest. US membership. So the 80 approved members do not include US and Japan as the two G7 countries that have so far chosen to stay out of AIIB. Both countries, just like any other eligible countries, are most welcome to join us. We are truly open, our articles say, to all members of either the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. That's the definition of the eligibility, nothing else. And every country, including the US, including Japan, would be most welcome to join. There's, to my knowledge, no particular initiative currently underway to make that happen in the short term, but we remain open to that. I would also emphasize that to emphasize the global character of our institution, we insist on global universal procurement and we have global hiring. That means that companies from non-member countries are eligible to bid for AIIB finance contracts. So US, Japanese companies are as eligible as any other companies to bid for contracts that are procured under our financing. And we have American and Japanese and other country staff because we really want to make sure we are run as a professional organization that hires the very best and want to insist for our clients that in their procurement they get the very best service at the lowest price, and that means we want the biggest possible competition and therefore don't exclude anybody even if they're from non-member countries.
So I'm afraid we've run out of time in this session. Joachim, thank you very much. I hope you'll have a few minutes to hang around, so to speak, in case people would like to speak individually. Thank you very much for coming from Beijing, and we hope to see you again here in Hong Kong.
My pleasure. Thank